Starting a new series today that will lead us throughout this season of Lent. And today very much is an intro. I don't have inserts today. I'll have them the rest of our time in this series. But just an introduction today, because here's why we are calling this series Finding God. Because as Christians, what do we believe? We believe that God is not a far-off God, that God in the child, in the manger, has come to be with us in a very intimate way. Think about what we just celebrated a few months ago. And so knowing that, we want to make sure, especially during this season of Lent, we want to make sure that we are not just searching for God when we're in this time and place. We want to make sure instead we are searching for God in all the nooks and crannies of our life. Because if we do that, we know what we will find. We will find God there. And at times, we'll find God in some unexpected places, in some surprising ways. Now, a foundational passage for us is found in the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 13. Here's what we find there. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan, really the beginning of his ministry. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days. Being tempted by Satan, he was with wild animals, and angels attended to him. I especially want you to hear again these words in verse 12. The Spirit immediately sent him out into the wilderness. Now, implied in that verse is this. Jesus wasn't planning on this. Heading into the wilderness. Instead, probably the human side of him was thinking, having been baptized by John, the human side of him was probably thinking, okay, let's go. I've got work to do. Healing and preaching and teaching and helping. And yet in the midst of him probably thinking that, here's what the Spirit does. The Spirit drives him into a time of reflection. The Spirit draws him into a time of soul searching, because that's really what this is. And it's with that image as our guide today. Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. With that image as our guide today, we turn to that which must be a part of our journey with God as well, especially during this season of Lent, these times of intentional reflection. And so if we know we need these, if we know they'll be beneficial to us, why is it sometimes we only seek God out in this place? Well, I think there's several reasons for that. And so today, again, introductory part of this series. Today, let's just talk about a few of them so that might help us be better prepared in the weeks ahead to embrace God beyond these walls. First, I think we sometimes fail to pursue God throughout the week or in other parts of our lives, because we get caught up in thinking sometimes when it comes to our walk with God, this is all that really matters, this time of worship. And while we're not going to spend a lot of time with this first one, because I'll even use the word hope. I hope it doesn't apply to many of us. It may apply to none of us. This sense of, I don't need to really seek God out in other parts of my life because this is all that matters. I want us to at least touch on it momentarily, though, because here's the reality, and I think y'all know this. The reality is, for some Christians, their faith is a 1 hour a week faith. And that makes worship the only time, the only place they seek God out. And I think we all would agree. If you do that, you miss out on the fullness of God. If you do that, you miss out on what God would like to embrace with you in this journey. Guys, most of our lives are spent beyond these walls. Jason and I might be the exception in this space right now. Most of our lives are spent beyond these walls. And so searching for God, finding God there is critical. And again, if this is something, as you think about it, where it at least causes you to pause for a moment and say, some weeks do I get caught up in a 1 hour a week faith and yearning for God. If there's any of that in you, then ponder that today, confess that today, and then begin to seek God out in other parts of your life. Again, that's what the next 5 weeks is going to be about, thinking about where we might seek God out. Here's another reason I think we often fail to search for God and find God beyond this time of worship. And gosh, we run into this when it comes to our faith so many times. We are just not intentional about it. Meaning maybe we hope we might run into God today or this week, but we're not really intentionally planning for that. Now, when it comes to this one, I think there are a couple of components. And the first component is this. Sometimes we're not intentional about searching for and communing with God beyond these walls because we're not carving out time in our schedule to allow that to happen. And again, it's not that we don't want to be with God. It's not that we don't want to move beyond a 1 hour a week faith. It's just that life goes on. Life gets in the way some days. And we get to the point of going to bed and we realize, I don't know if I've spoken to God once. I don't know if I've listened once to what God might have been wanting to say to me. Makes sense? Think back to our passage from earlier for a moment when we find this in verses 12 and 13. At once the Spirit sent Jesus out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days. Now I share that again for this reason, because sometimes, like for Jesus in this moment, sometimes it will be God's Spirit within us that is driving us into these times of reflection with God. But most of the time, and we find this in Jesus' story as well, most of the time that's going to fall to us to create that space. And so when it comes to intentionality, we got to make sure we are intentionally clearing time for that in our schedule. But then here's another part of this intentionality thing. Sometimes we fail to search for God and find God beyond this time of worship because our expectations are so incredibly low. Meaning even if we do clear time to engage God during the week, we don't really expect that time together to mean that much. And if there's a bit of that in us today, then we need to change that. For example, in this series, we're going to be talking about finding God in creation. And I wonder, when you head out for a walk of a morning, when you head out for a jog in the midst of your journey, are you intentionally thinking, God, where might I encounter you today in the midst of creation? I promise you, if you just offer that up to God, you're going to find him in some special ways. Or in this series, we're going to be talking about finding God in the midst of our relationships. And I wonder, as you engage conversations, as you engage time with those God has placed in your life, do you begin those engagements just saying deep within, God, I wonder how I might experience you in the midst of this encounter with this other person? As I promise you, you do that, you'll find him there in important ways. Now, even if we do clear space, even if we do bring an intentionality to searching for and finding God beyond these walls, one final thing remains for us to deal with. And that is our apprehension. That is our fear. Meaning sometimes we don't search for God beyond these walls because we're afraid of what we might experience if we truly engage God more deeply throughout the week. Think back again to Jesus' experience in this passage. I mean, he heads into this wonderful and fruitful time with God. And that really is what it is. He comes through this closer to God than ever. And yet what do we find here? We find temptation, we find testing, we find a bunch of hardship here. And so even when we know this is a good thing for Jesus, we begin to think, I don't know if I want that in my life. If I withdraw and reflect with God, what might that mean? Truth is, some of our encounters with God, if we're open to them, seek them out, expect them to happen, some of them will push us and challenge us and get us out of our comfort zone. But at the same time, don't you agree, God wouldn't lead us into those things if we didn't need them. And so lastly, just recognize today that sometimes we fail to search for God even when we need God most. Sometimes we fail to reach out to Him because we're afraid of facing some of the struggles we need to face. And especially in the midst of this season of Lent, if we feel some of that reluctance, let's push through that. Expect God to really bless us, even in the midst of some of our most difficult times. Today we begin a journey to the cross and a journey to the empty tomb. We begin a journey to Jesus' death and to His resurrection. In the midst of this journey, we are potentially going to be able to grow, to change in the ways we need to change, but only if we seek God out beyond this time together. Resolve this day to do just that. Let's pray.